Hey guys, today we're going to be doing an aftermarket Tach installation. The aftermarket tachometer we're going to be installing is from Autometer, and we're going to be putting into a 1989 Ford Mustang. The reason why you might want to get an aftermarket Tach is because you want to have a bigger display and something with a shift light to know when to shift accurately when you're racing, also to get a more accurate readout as well compared to the factory unit. Today's unit we're installing is a universal application, so it has a bracket right here that we're going to just screw into the dash. Your Tach, with all the wires already pre-run, and a shift light that just plugs in. When trying to obtain Tach from a vehicle, there are a variety of places where you can get it. You can get it off the distributor, you can get it off the coil, you can get it off the injector. A lot of vehicles, like a lot of Japanese vehicles mainly, have diagnostic plugs where you can grab Tach signal from there. So always consult a professional and also a wiring database to make sure you're hooking up to the proper areas. That way you're not going to damage any vehicle electronics. Typically for remote starts, when we do them, we have to hook up Tachs on some vehicles to the motor so that way the remote starter knows when to disengage the starter. I am doing a remote starter and security combo in this Mustang, so I was grabbing Tach, but I'm grabbing Tach from two different places. The reason why I'm doing that is because I don't want to hook up the remote starter and the aftermarket tachometer to the same point. Just for safety, we don't know if the two devices are going to backfeed into each other, either causing misreadings or just damaging each other. So what I did for the remote starter was I just picked this injector over here. If you're dealing with a remote starter, going off the injector is perfectly safe, and the easiest way to tell is when you're looking at the injector, typically you're going to see is two wires, and there's always going to be a constant like color wire. In this case on this Mustang it's red, so on every single injector there's red. So you go on the other wire where it's a variable. So if you're going to change colors, the wire that's a different color is the wire that's going to be pulsing. And that's what you're going to use for your remote starter feed. And then for the tachometer, we're going to go right off the coil here. I verified it on my database, it is the same color, and also on Autometer's database, it is green with a yellow stripe. So that's the cool thing about Autometer is they have full support on their website alone to help you do your installation, to make sure you do it properly, and we're going to grab the signal right off here. Okay, I'm going to show you a test on how to see what's going on a multimeter. So we can see here we have it on the AC setting. Now, unfortunately, this particular multimeter does not react fast enough. We're not going to see it exactly what's happening because the signal is just pulsing so fast. So what you're going to see though is when the motor starts, I'm not going to have the motor on, I'm just going to have it off right now just to show you. So you see we have 0 right now. What I have the multimeter on is I have one prong on ground, and then the other prong is going to go onto the portion of coil. And what we're going to do now is we're going to fire up the motor and let it idle, and then afterwards we're going to rev the motor a couple times, and then you'll see the multimeter fluctuate. So go ahead and start it. So you see there's a little bit of variation in the multimeter, but this is the correct wire that we need to tap into. When doing any kind of electronic work, I like to study the manual and figure out what each wire does because I tend to prep devices the same way. So what I've done here is we had all the color-coded wires exposed, all the different colors, and we don't need it to be visible after the installation. So we don't want this to be on the dash and see a bunch of colors. It doesn't need to look like Skittles on your dash basically. So what I did was vinyl tape underneath and then exterior tester tape on top to make it look nice. And what I do is I try to keep all the wires that I need grouped together. So these guys over here, this is the power wire, so they're power and ground. They're kind of going in the same vicinity. And then the green wire here is going to be attached to Tach. And then this one over here is our white wire, and this is going to go to the illumination or parking light circuit. That way it will turn on at night. When dealing with these universal Tachs, you're going to have to find a home for it. So you can see here I've carefully measured it by eye, not my car. And you can see what I've done is I've pre-drilled the holes. I'm going to highly recommend you pre-drill the holes and thread it in by hand afterwards, because on these older cars, especially a lot of American cars didn't use the best plastics, and they could be sun-dried by now. So if you don't pre-drill it, you just try to fire in a screw, there's a high chance you're just going to crack it. The other thing is you have to take note of what you're drilling into. There are some switches here for the hazard lights. I've actually moved it further back to avoid it, and I'm using the shallowest screw possible. And when you put it in by hand, one, you're going to be a lot easier on the material, and you're kind of going to feel if there's something wrong. Next, all you have to do is slip the tachometer into the bracket, so you loosen both the brackets and get the angle you want. You saw it could swivel before, so this makes the most ergonomical sense. It's close to the hazard light switch, where we can turn it on and turn it off with our fingers fitting in it. Eric wanted to have the shift light mounted to the actual display here. The cool thing about this is you can actually mount the shift light in other locations. It is separate, and there's a plug here. You might have to extend the wires. If you don't want to extend the wires, you don't want to deal with any of that, you can just slip it into the bracket right here, and all we have to do is tuck all this wiring so we don't see any of it. So when all your wiring's done up by the tach, you shouldn't see a bunch of wires everywhere. You can see I didn't really go crazy by shortening everything, drilling a bunch of holes in the dash. I basically just tried to tuck everything here in case we decided to move the shift light. We didn't disturb any of this wiring, we just cut these zap straps and move it over. But everything's tucked along here, we're running along this edge here on the dash. That way we don't really notice anything, so when we're looking at the tach, it's aesthetically pleasing. And even as a passenger, we don't notice anything amiss about this. Everything blends very nicely. Let's recap the install lower on the dash. You can see here what I did was, you can't really see the wiring because I unbolted the instrument cluster and I just moved it just enough out of the way, so down this line over by where the main dash meets this cluster, I tucked all the wiring in here, and that way you can't see it. As far as the ignition line goes, you have to hook up to main ignition. I prefer to hook up to true ignition. What true ignition is it's 12 volts during the crank cycle, because accessory actually goes to ground. That way you're not sucking juice from the battery as you're trying to pull cold cranking amps. So you want to test for that and hook it up to a fuse, because there's no fuse in line on the red. You have to add your own. If you don't, you risk a fire, so you have to add this. For ground, I went on the subframe here because there's a factory ground on it, so we attached to that. And we also hooked up to the parking light circuit because I was doing my remote starter as well, so I grabbed that from the driver's kick. That way when we turn on our parking lights, you can see the lights that happen on, the lights that will turn on the tachometer as well. And the wire that you saw that I hooked up under the hood, I passed to the firewall through grommets down here. We're going to loom this. This over here we have to tuck away because this is for hooking up to a laptop when they're doing their engine tuning. When you've completed everything, your wiring under the dash and under the hood should look something similar to this. What I've used here is electrical vinyl tape to cover up and insulate all my connections, and then to finish it off I'm using exterior Testa tape. It does look pretty factory, but what I find is with this particular tape is it's extremely durable. So this is going to look like this for a very long time. Okay, so you finished your installation, you've run all the wire neatly, you've grabbed 12 volts from a safe source at the ignition, you've grounded it at chassis, you also grab parking lights off the parking light circuit, and you grab tach safely off the motor, and now you're ready to fire it up. So first we're going to do is we're going to turn the ignition on, and we're going to just test for operation. So we're going to turn on the parking lights. I will not hook this up to a dimmer because it's an LED, and on a dimmer circuit it only works properly with incandescent bulbs. So you want to hook up just to the parking lights, so it's basically just on or off. So those work good. Okay, we're going to fire up the motor now. Oh, before I do that, let's just check where our shift light indicator turns on. So I have it set just before 5,000 RPM. I will let the owner decide where they want the shift points to be. I know this is just, just for demonstration purposes. There is a cap that we will put on here afterwards, so when we're driving this will not show up because it is a distraction for the driver. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, if you didn't notice, rewind it and watch how I was testing it. You'll notice that the odometer gauge is slightly quicker than the factory gauge. Well, one, the car has 267,000 kilometers on it, so that is older, and those factory gauges technically aren't as accurate as these aftermarket ones. That's why it's huge for these racing guys to have these, because one, it's a bigger display with the shift light. They don't really have to take their eyes off the road to know when to shift, but because this is more accurate, we actually are shifting at the proper points, because that one's kind of slow. You might be over revving, or you might be going past your torque curve, so you're revving the motor to a point where you're not gaining any more power for acceleration when you should be grabbing the next gear. That's why it's nice to have a piece like this. Let's say though you have a newer vehicle, or you're just not a fan of having gauges all over the place. Like, those are factory gauges up here on the 350Z, but let's say you're not a fan of having on the A-pillar or compromising your vents like in the Mustang. There are other alternatives. You can see here I have Grady's Infometer Touch. I basically took a piece of MDF and I custom fit a bezel to this little storage compartment. I figure, I'm never going to leave anything in here. I always want a display of some sort. I just need to figure out the product. So I got this from Grady, and it's a 3.5-inch screen, so it is very small, but the cool thing is, though, it's customizable. So over time, if I need to look at any other information, depending on the vehicle that you hook it up to, you can actually display up to 6 gauges at a time on this particular setting. So you can see here I have an injector percentage. I can see how much my intake manifold is flowing. I can see ignition timing, throttle position, and these two over here is for my air fuel ratio. This is the O2 setting, so I just have to know, if it's 0.45, I'm running pretty good. If I'm leaning out towards 1 volt, it's richening up. If it's going really low, it's pretty much leaning out quite a bit. So I am a fan of knowing what's going on with my motor too, but there are different ways of delivering it. This is a little bit more discreet and technically not as accurate, because the refresh time wouldn't be as fast or as accurate as an analog gauge like on those odometers. But if you just want to have a very good general idea of what's going on with the motor, this is a great alternative. And if you don't want to look at it, you don't have to. To see what else I'm up to, make sure to check out my Instagram and Facebook, AnthonyJ350, and also check out our website at www.gofasthavefun.ca.